Hi, I'm James from Chaosium. I sat down with Lynne Hardy, who is an associate editor for Call of Cthulhu and line editor for the Rivers of London tabletop role-playing game. We talked about designing a magic system. Rivers of London is up for an Emmy, and I thought it was the perfect time to talk about all the work that the team behind the Rivers of London role-playing game put into mechanizing the systems to bring the magic of Rivers of London to life. I started off the interview by asking Lynne why there are so many different approaches to magic systems in tabletop role-playing games. I'll jump across to the interview in a moment. First, please remember to subscribe, and thanks for watching.
I think it's because magic is trying to do lots of different things. And it depends on how you want to use it in your storytelling. Um, Quite often, magic is a great way round problems. It's a problem solver. You've got a big door in your way that's locked. You can cast a spell that's either going to explode it, pick its lock. If you do, you can do all sorts of whiz bang, flashy, cool things. Most of us, I think, at some point, either when we were little or even still now, have, played at being wizards of some sort. There's that thought of having a spell or a magic item that would just make your life that little bit easier and a lot less complex. It's really appealing. And I think that's why it tends to crop up so often in various game systems. It's it's an interesting way of telling stories. It's a way of having extra power. It's a way of um, dealing with issues in an interesting and creative way.
The main problem with magic in TTRPGs, the way I see it, is kind of to do with the fundamental structure of a game and of magic. Magic is indefinable, it can solve every problem. And TTRPGs, you want to be able to limit things, sort of, so you can structure a story. You want to be able to apply rules. Are those two ever marryable?
Yes, and I think quite a few games have actually managed that successfully. Um, the main problem with magic in games is the same problem that you have with psionic powers and anything like that. It's sort of power creep and balance issues. Because what you don't want is to create a character who's way more powerful in the party group than everybody else, so that everybody else is just standing around watching that other person grandstanding. And systems have all got ways to either ameliorate that or just make sure it's not so much of an issue. So let's face it, you have magic points of some stripe or another. You have consequences for overusing magic, usually in the hurting yourself in one way or another because you've drained all your energy, because this still requires some effort and energy on your part. Um, Sometimes balance isn't necessarily achievable. It depends on your world. From what I remember of Ars Magica, let's face it, those doing magic are an elite and they spend their entire lives doing that and kind of pretty much nothing else. So but play is structured in that game to support that, in the fact that you're not always playing a magician, you're playing other characters as well, and you turn and turn about in who you are playing.
I like the direction taking the conversation because it starts to talk about magic systems in games that are mechanized a little more complexly. I am a big fan of a lot of narrative games, indie games that have a less granular feel, but this discussion, I want to talk a little bit about the more mechanized magic systems. Something I notice is that they tend to all really end up in spell lists. Why is that the best structure or the most conventional approach to come at designing a magic system from?
I think because it makes both the GM's and the player's life easier to a certain extent. You can still get some pretty complex spell lists, but having it laid out with a clear progression from beginning spell, more complicated spell, expert spell, helps players and GMs judge power level, what people are capable of, how they are likely to affect a story. And that is one of the things with magic systems that can trip people up, is that when you're right, particularly when you're writing investigations, is the fact that, people tend to think, well, can they hit it? Can they shoot it? Can they trip it up? Can they do something else to it? And they don't necessarily always remember that, well, is there a spell that can also do that? Is there a spell that is going to get round my carefully constructed plot element that I haven't thought about? So having spell lists where you can see things very clearly, what can be achieved, what can be done, can help you plug plot holes. It can help as inspiration. It makes it accessible to people in that you have a clear framework. As opposed to something of a more storytelling type thing where you are picking bits and bobs and you're putting them together and you're creating effects on the fly. That's much harder to anticipate. It's much harder to, again, react on the fly so that the player doesn't feel that their contributions are being downgraded because they don't fit with what the GM thought was going to happen or should happen. And they're also less intimidating for new players.
So why we're having this discussion here today is because of Rivers of London. And Rivers of London is currently up for some Annie Awards, and it felt like a really good time to talk about designing magic systems, which you and the rest of the Rivers of London team had to do making this tabletop role-playing game. You also had to do it adapting a magic system from an established IP. That's a complicated process, and I want to hear a lot about it. But to start with, because you come from a Call of Cthulhu background as a writer and editor as well, why aren't we talking about Call of Cthulhu now? And I'll feed to you, it's because I don't really think Call of Cthulhu magic is really magic. Would that be fair to say?
I mean, it is, but it's got really nasty consequences. And again, this is going back to the idea of why have you got magic? What is its role? What storytelling is it supporting? And the thing with magic in Call of Cthulhu is that it's usually a desperate measure to deal with the horrible greeblies because pretty much everything else has failed. Magic in Call of Cthulhu is the first step, usually, on a very slippery slope, because once you've started, that's kind of it. You are opening yourself up to the dark forces of the mythos in the universe and inviting them in. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of energy, it's incredibly dangerous. And yeah, once you've taken that step, there's no going back. You know, it's part of that spiral that leads to your eventual doom. Now, obviously, Magic in Rivers of London, none of the games is very, very different. There are consequences in Rivers of London. It's hypothermaturgical degradation, which is the fact that if you do too much magic or you do it wrong, you're going to damage your brain, which can have long-term medical effects, which happens a couple of times in the various novels. So it's not without consequence, but Magic in Rivers has a very different role in the storytelling. It isn't every day, but it also is. It's just bubbling under the surface. There's a lot of people know how to do it, but don't necessarily know how to do it well. You're not dealing with chosen ones in the fact there's only certain people can. Anybody can. They're just likely to hurt themselves if they don't have proper training. And it's also an interesting magic system in that there are so many different approaches to that magic and how it is viewed, how it is revered or not revered, how it is mistrusted or trusted, depending on people's backgrounds. And it's nice that there isn't a one size fits all. Ben hasn't at the moment explored all of that, but it's laid in that each culture has its own traditions and ways of dealing with magic. And I think that's really nice because it gives you more opportunities for storytelling.
So to throw some of your own words back at you here, why is there magic in Rivers of London? What's the purpose that it serves? What does it do in the game?
It provides a means to deal with issues. It provides a means to tell interesting stories. It marks people out as being something different, something slightly more, something slightly in the shadows, because in Rivers of London, while magic is becoming more and more ubiquitous, it's still not widely recognized by the general public. So you've got this whole two streams running parallel of the normal world and the world of the demimond, who are people who can use magic, have been touched by magic, who are born magical.
I've noticed it can be difficult in a tabletop role-playing game to balance non-magical players with magical players. And it can be so extreme in some cases that some games make non-magical players feel like wizards. They have spell lists, but they just happen to be abilities about whacking people with a hammer or charging across a room. Rivers of London has magic and non-magic players. How do you balance that?
We try to balance it with advantages. So during character creation, you get to choose an advantage. Now, if you want to be able to cast spells, you have to take the magical advantage. You have two advantage slots, if you like. Magical takes up both of them. So as a starting character, that's all you get. If you're a non-magic using character, you can have up to two advantages, which will give you various bonuses to your toughness, to your damage, to certain skill rolls in terms of contacts that you can touch up for information that you might need during a scenario. So we have tried to balance it as much as possible. We've also built in a mechanism that if somebody starts off as a non-magic user, they can learn it later on. You know, they can acquire what we call development points and save those up so that they can buy the magical advantage further down the road. Because that reflects the fact that you have characters in the novels who don't start out as magic users, but then learn as the books go on. Because this is the core thing in Rivers of London, is that, as I said before, anyone can learn magic. There's no special gift to doing it. You just need to find out how to do it. Some people do that accidentally in the books. Some people are trained how to do it to a greater or lesser and safer extent.
I'd love to know, you have this book, this world with this very established magic system, and you get it and you get to design a mechanical system behind it. Now, obviously, there are some constraints that you want to consider, but that idea of just being able to take an IP and ground up how it works like that, what was that like? What was your process for doing that and the rest of the teams?
Well, obviously, it's tricky to a certain extent because you have to make sure that the system that you create mirrors what's in the books, is true to that, and performs the same purpose. You know, a way to advance the story and come up with creative solutions. Ben, thankfully, being a gamer, had already done a lot of the legwork for us. Okay, it's a very Ars Magica type system in that you put keywords together to perform spell effects. Now that, as we've discussed elsewhere, was a bit more advanced than we really wanted, seeing as we were hoping this was going to be an introductory game, people. But also because of the way the spells were constructed, in the fact that you put these words together to form your spells, the more words you put together, the more powerful the spell is, which also fits very nicely into a level-based system. So we had this choice to make, and Paul and I discussed this with Ben and Mike Mason. He's like, well, which one's going to be the best one to go with? We know from the books, thematically at least, the winging it system would be more accurate, but more intimidating and harder for new GMs and new players to pick up and actually run with. So we went with the more straightforward level-based system because it still very closely echoes what's in the books, but is more accessible to new players and GMs.
How do you make magic still feel magical when you are putting these very harsh limits on?
That's tricky, and that's why I was very fortunate to work with such a gifted designer as Paul Fricker. Also, as we've mentioned before in other videos that we've done, Ben is a gamer, was a gamer, knows his stuff, and knows how to adapt things. We did have to make some changes. We've altered some of the spell levels based on how they're described in the books. We've altered some of their effects slightly, just to try and rein in some of that power creep, and also to make them to give them some variation, so they're not all just monster damage dealing spells, basically, to try and encourage role playing and creative thought and use of basic spells, which is also part of the novels. Peter Grant comes up with some very clever ideas of ways to use what on the surface seem like very basic, simple spells. And that was something we wanted to encourage too. So you've still got that player input to how the spell is used, but actual accessibility to those spells is very structured and straightforward.
When we talk about a lot of magic systems for established TTRPGs, we are talking about the ones that have been around for a long time, and those magic systems have evolved a very long way. You can think of Ars Magica as it is today, or something like Dungeons and Dragons, and you can look at the way that their spells have completely shifted, become very, very powerful, very, very focused. With Rivers of London up for these awards, you'd hope that it's going to be around for a very, very long time. If this line is years down the track and we've seen iteration upon iterations, refinements, added complexity, what is the ultimate end state of Magic in Rivers of London for you?
I think the ultimate end state is to give people the choice. Do you want to stick with the initial system, refined as it may be, so that we've got that balance more tweaked and tailored, so that you have your levels and you advance through your levels and your spell trees and your related spells. So you need to learn this one before you can learn this one. But if you prefer and you have the confidence to go for it, I'm going to put these two words together and see what happens, that you have that choice. Both will reflect what is in the novels, but it's a matter of personal preference within a gaming group as to which one you go for.
So the whole point of Magic is that you can do anything. There are no rules. That said, to finish the video off, what's the one thing you should never do when you're designing a Magic system? What's the one rule you have to follow?
I think it's important with Magic in a game that you don't think of it as a sledgehammer. You think of it as another creative storytelling tool. If you have Magic in your game and you're a GM, always consider how your players can use that magic to help advance the story. And sometimes it's something that you can forget. But when you are creating scenarios or case files or whatever you want to call them, have a look at that spell list and see what's available and give the players with Magic room to use what they have. Because there's nothing going to frustrate your players more than them having this wonderful bank of spells and not getting the opportunity to actually use them in a game situation.